When Jake's father, Carl, a former Marine, is humiliated by two HOA enforcers in his own neighborhood, the injustice feels unbearable. The enforcers, arrogantly pushing aside a frail man without a second thought, spark Jake's fury. But when Carl reveals his military background, everything changes, and Jake makes one call that turns the tide. Just wait until you see how this shocking twist restores justice, leaving the enforcers with nothing but regret. It was just another quiet morning in Oakridge Estates, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured, and every house seemed to hold the promise of an ideal life. From the outside, it was the picture of suburban perfection, a place where nothing ever seemed out of place. But for Jake, that morning was about to take a sharp turn. He had been helping his father, Carl, a former Marine Corps Reserve officer, to the local coffee shop. The walk was slow, but steady. Carl, though in his late 60s, still held his posture with the discipline of a man who'd spent his youth in uniform. But age and the weight of time had taken their toll, and today, like many others, Carl was using his walker. As they crossed the parking lot, the sound of an engine revving shattered the calm morning air. The tires screeched as a black SUV rolled to a stop right in front of them. Two figures stepped out, both wearing the same cold, officious look. Two HOA enforcers. One was young, in his 20s, with a smug expression that screamed of someone who'd never had to face real hardship. The other was middle-aged, his face hard and determined, as if his sole purpose in life was to uphold some misguided sense of order. Without any greeting, the younger enforcer raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "Hey, you can't block the sidewalk," the young man barked, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Move along now." Carl paused, looking up at the man. He'd barely made it a few steps down the lot, but the enforcer didn't seem to care. The older man added, "It's HOA rules, obstruction of the walkway. Move the walker off the property, or we'll have to call for a citation." Jake blinked in disbelief. Was this really happening? They had a rule for walkers now? His father, who had spent decades serving his country, was being treated like a nuisance in his own neighborhood. Carl, clearly too tired to argue, let out a soft sigh. He began to slowly pivot, trying to steer the walker off to the side, but that's when it happened. The younger enforcer, in a burst of impatience, pushed Carl's walker roughly out of the way. It wasn't a light shove. It was deliberate and uncalled for. The sound of the walker scraping against the pavement sent a jolt through Jake's chest. His father's body lurched forward as he struggled to maintain his balance. The audacity of it! Jake's heart pounded, a mixture of shock and disbelief rushing through him. This was more than an inconvenience. It was humiliation. His father, a man who had sacrificed his youth, his health, and his service for this country, had just been treated like some kind of criminal by these self-righteous strangers with no respect for the man standing before them. They hadn't even looked at Carl with any semblance of kindness or understanding. They hadn't even bothered to see him as a person, just another violation to enforce, another rule to follow. Carl winced in pain as he steadied himself, his hands gripping the walker with what little strength he had left. His eyes, though tired and aged, flickered with something deeper. Anger, yes, but more than that. A recognition of the unfairness of it all. Jake stepped forward, his fists clenching at his sides, but Carl's soft voice stopped him before he could speak. "Jake, don't." Carl's words were calm, but there was a quiet pain in his voice. He didn't have the energy to fight back, not physically, but Jake could feel the rage bubbling up inside him, an intense fire igniting in his chest. This wasn't just about a walker or a petty rule anymore. It was about respect, or, rather, the lack of it. The way they had treated his father, it was unacceptable. And it wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was deliberate. As Carl adjusted his grip and carefully moved to the side, Jake's fists tightened even more, his mind racing. How could anyone treat a man like that, especially a man who had given everything for others? This was more than just an inconvenience. It was an injustice. And it wasn't going to end here, not today. The enforcers stood there, oblivious to the storm they had just started, but Jake felt something shift in him, a deep resolve. This wasn't over. Jake stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The scene before him felt unreal. His father, Carl, the man who once commanded battalions of Marines, the man who had led others into the most difficult situations with unwavering strength, had just been reduced to this. Reduced to a frail, helpless figure who was being shoved aside by a pair of arrogant strangers who had no understanding of the sacrifices Carl had made. Jake's eyes burned with disbelief, and then that disbelief quickly transformed into something far more dangerous: rage. This wasn't just some petty rule violation or minor misunderstanding. This was an attack on Carl's dignity, on his service, on everything he had stood for in his life. These enforcers, these self-righteous bullies, weren't just pushing around an old man with a walker. They were dismissing a man who had fought for this country, a man who had given up so much for the very freedoms these petty officials took for granted. It felt like a punch to the gut. The more Jake thought about it, the angrier he became. These people had no idea who Carl was, no idea what he had done, what he had seen, what he had sacrificed. They didn't see a former Marine. They didn't see a father. They saw an obstacle, a problem to deal with, a nuisance to push aside. Jake's blood began to boil. Every second of this humiliating encounter stoked the flames inside him. His fists clenched so tight he could feel the nails biting into his palm. It wasn't just a matter of principle anymore. This was deeply personal. He took a step forward, his voice shaking with the weight of his frustration. "You, both of you, need to apologize," he said, trying to keep his composure, but his tone betrayed his anger. "What you did was wrong. You have no idea who you're dealing with. This man, my father, deserves respect." The young enforcer didn't even flinch. He looked at Jake like he was some kind of inconvenience. "Apologize?" he scoffed. "For what? For doing our job? You need to calm down, man. You're the one causing a scene." His eyes glinted with amusement, clearly enjoying the power he held in this moment, even if it was fleeting and undeserved. Jake's chest tightened, his heart racing as the younger man's words sank in. How dare he? How dare this kid, who probably hadn't even served a day in his life, talk to him like that? And then, just when Jake thought it couldn't get any worse, the middle-aged enforcer chimed in. "If you don't stop causing a disturbance, we'll have no choice but to report you," he said, his voice thick with authority. But it was empty, just a hollow attempt to flex power. Jake couldn't hold back anymore. The disrespect, the casual dismissal of Carl, of everything his father had done, had reached a boiling point. The injustice was suffocating, and his anger was no longer something he could just sit with. His father had fought for this country. He had led men into battle, put his life on the line, and now, after all that, he was being treated like this, like nothing more than a nuisance to be discarded. It was too much. Jake's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming, suffocating anger that coursed through him. It felt like every part of him was on fire. His father, who had always been his hero, his pillar of strength, was now the one being humiliated by these two strangers who couldn't even begin to understand the weight of his service. And it wasn't just the humiliation. It was the fact that these enforcers didn't even care. They weren't sorry. They weren't even trying to understand. They were just going through the motions, making up rules to justify their behavior, treating Carl like he was a problem to be fixed. Jake took a deep breath, his voice trembling with the power of his anger. "You have no idea what it means to serve this country. You have no idea what it's like to give everything for something greater than yourself. But I swear to you, I'm not going to let you get away with this." The younger enforcer simply smirked, clearly amused by Jake's words, but something in his gaze faltered, just for a second. It was a fleeting moment, but Jake caught it. He saw the crack in the enforcer's arrogance. He knew that deep down, even this young man was starting to realize that what he had done was wrong. But it didn't matter. Not yet. Jake was consumed by the rage building up inside him, the kind of anger only a son could feel when watching his father, his hero, be treated like this. This wasn't over. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was a promise. Jake would make sure these men understood just who they had messed with. He would make sure they paid for their disrespect. And in that moment, standing there with his father, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a walker or an HOA rule. This was about fighting for what was right. And Jake wasn't going to back down. The tension in the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Jake stood there, fists still clenched, his body shaking with the weight of his anger. The enforcers didn't seem to care. They stood there, smug, thinking they had all the power. But then, through the haze of frustration and fury, a voice broke through. It was Carl's voice, weak but steady. "Son," Carl said, his voice quiet but commanding enough to stop Jake in his tracks. Jake turned to see his father, his once powerful figure now frail and exhausted, but still holding himself with dignity. Carl gripped the rails of his walker, his hands trembling, yet his posture was defiant. There was a strength in his gaze that Jake hadn't seen in a long time. His father's words had power, a quiet authority that made the enforcers pause, if only for a moment. "These men may think they can break me," Carl continued, his voice unwavering, "but they don't know who I am." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he couldn't look away as his father straightened his back, his frailty seeming to fade for a moment, replaced by something deeper, something that commanded respect. "I am Carl Adams," he said, his voice suddenly cold, sharp, like a blade being drawn. "Former major in the Marine Corps Reserves." He locked eyes with the enforcers, the calm authority in his voice carrying more weight than Jake could ever have expected. "If you've forgotten what that means, maybe I should remind you." The younger enforcer sneered, still dismissive, but something in the older man's eyes shifted. For the first time, doubt flickered. He hesitated, just a brief moment, but long enough for Jake to catch it. That hesitation was everything. Jake felt the surge of determination flood his chest. His father's words had cut through the chaos, and now Jake knew exactly what he had to do. He reached for his phone, his fingers steady as he dialed the number that would change everything. He didn't hesitate. His voice was firm when the call connected. "Get me Captain Harris," Jake said. "Now." The realization hit him hard, but it was clear. Carl's past wasn't just a forgotten piece of history. It was the very thing that could bring these men to their knees. Jake had the power to remind them who they were messing with, and he wasn't about to let this moment slip away. Minutes passed, but to Jake it felt like an eternity. His phone call had set things in motion. The tension between them was thick, and for a moment the two enforcers seemed to freeze, unsure of what was coming. Then the truth came to light. The older enforcer's face drained of color as he listened, his confidence vanishing with each passing second. Carl wasn't just a former Marine. He wasn't just some old man with a walker. Carl Adams was a man who had trained some of the very officers who managed local security. The call Jake had made wasn't to some random authority. It was to the director of the local Marine Corps Reserve Office, someone Carl had mentored years ago, someone who knew the weight of Carl's legacy. I didn't know," the older enforcer stammered, suddenly aware of the gravity of the situation. Jake stood tall, his chest swelling with pride, as he placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "Yeah, you didn't. But now you will remember this lesson. You don't mess with people who've served this country, especially not my dad." The enforcers were silent now, their arrogance gone. The younger one looked down, while the older man's eyes flickered with regret. Slowly, they stepped back, deflated. Without another word, they returned Carl's walker, the gesture almost apologetic in its humility. As they turned and walked away, their heads low, Jake felt a sense of satisfaction that settled deep within him. It was an unexpected feeling, a quiet kind of victory. Justice had been served, not just because they'd been put in their place, but because Carl's dignity had been restored. In that moment, Jake knew that his father's strength wasn't just in his past achievements, but in the respect he commanded, even when it was least expected. Carl smiled faintly, his weary eyes shining with something Jake hadn't seen in a long time: pride. "You did good, son," he said softly, the words simple but carrying a weight that no one could take away. And for once, everything felt right. In a world that often forgot the value of respect, this moment felt like a quiet reminder of what truly mattered.